Many people have received verdicts that altered their lives forever. The harsh sound of a gavel rings out in courtrooms as justice slips away. Just when they'd given up on justice, a spark of hope emerges. DNA evidence that questions the harsh accusations and uncovers the hidden stories of those wrongly condemned to death. Today, we'll explore stories of individuals sentenced to death for crimes they didn't commit, but were later saved by profound DNA evidence. Kerry Max Cook. State, Texas. Date of exoneration, June 29, 2024.
It's omnipotent. I mean, you don't have a choice. Either you want your respect, and you want, after you've been raped, and you want your respect restored.
The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals declared Kerry Max Cook to be factually innocent of the brutal murder of Linda Jo Edwards in the city of Tyler in 1977. Cook had been tried 3 times, convicted twice of capital murder, and sentenced to death. However, in 2012, several other items from the crime scene were submitted for DNA testing, including Edwards' clothes, a knife, a cigarette butt, and various bloody swabs. Cook's DNA was not found on any of these items. This declared him innocent, and he was exonerated. Noel Montalvo. State, Pennsylvania. Date of exoneration, December 18, 2023. An all-white jury convicted Noel Montalvo on 2 counts of murder, burglary, and conspiracy on March 19, 2003. The same jury later sentenced Montalvo to death for the murder of an individual named Asensio and life in prison for another named Lugo.
They pushed me to say something, that this man was in jail for 23 years, innocent.
However, York County District Attorney David Sunday Jr. later said, "My office reviewed all of the physical evidence and original forensic testing performed in this case. We determined that there were items from the crime scene where further DNA testing would be necessary to determine if any physical evidence existed linking Noel Montalvo to the murders of Miriam Asensio and Nelson Lugo. This review of the physical evidence was exhaustive, and numerous items were submitted for DNA evidence through state and private laboratories. We now have the results of these tests, and none of the evidence at the crime scene possessed DNA belonging to Noel Montalvo." This ended Noel Montalvo's death sentence. Jesse Lee Johnson. State, Oregon. Date of exoneration, September 5, 2023.
Because the ball is in the court of the prosecutors in Oregon now. The Oregon Attorney General has about a month to decide whether to ask the Oregon Supreme Court.
Jesse Johnson was released from Marion County Jail in Oregon when prosecutors formally declined to retry him for the 1988 murder of Harriet Thompson. Mr. Johnson was convicted of Miss Thompson's murder in 2004 and sentenced to death. In asking the Marion County Circuit Court to dismiss the case against Mr. Johnson, the County District Attorney's Office stated that based upon the amount of time that has passed and the unavailability of critical evidence in this case, the state no longer believes that it can prove the defendant is guilt. There was no DNA evidence directly connecting Mr. Johnson to the murder. John Norman Huffington. State, Maryland. Date of exoneration, January 13, 2023. John Norman Huffington was wrongfully convicted and imprisoned for the murders of Joseph Hudson and Diane Becker, spending nearly 32 years in prison.
When we're made aware of an error.
In 2023, Governor Larry Hogan granted Huffington a full pardon based on prosecutorial misconduct, effectively wiping away the determination of guilt. This pardon came after a 2017 Alford plea, in which Huffington maintained his innocence but conceded that existing evidence might lead to a guilty verdict. The evidence used to convict Huffington included hair evidence analyzed using a discredited method that falsely concluded the hair found at the crime scene was microscopically identical to Huffington's hair. Sherwood Brown. State, Mississippi. Date of exoneration, August 24, 2021. Sherwood Brown was convicted and sentenced to death. However, he was exonerated of these charges and released on August 24, 2021, after 28 years of incarceration, 22 of which were spent on death row. Brown was sentenced to death for the murder of 13-year-old Evangela Boyd and received 2 life sentences for the murders of her mother and grandmother. His convictions and death sentence rested in substantial part on false expert forensic testimony. DNA evidence later showed that bloody footprints in and around the murder scene contained only female DNA, and the blood spot on Brown's shoe contained only male DNA. DNA testing on a swab of Boyd's saliva did not contain Brown's DNA, refuting the claim that she had bitten Brown. DNA tests on the sexual assault kit collected during the autopsy found no DNA from Brown, but showed that Evangelista Boyd's pubic hair and her bra contained DNA from unidentified males. A forensic scientist from the Mississippi Crime Laboratory concluded that none of the hair evidence recovered from the clothing and bodies of the victims had any microscopic characteristics similar to Brown's hair, and a crime lab fingerprint analyst found that none of the fingerprints found at the scene belonged to Brown. Eddie Lee Howard. State, Mississippi. Date of exoneration, January 7, 2021. On January 7, 2021, the Lowndes County, Mississippi District Attorney's Office dismissed the murder charge that sent Eddie Lee Howard Jr. to prison for more than 26 years. The dismissal came following a reinvestigation that discredited the bite mark and arson evidence that had convicted Mr. Howard in 1994. At an evidentiary hearing in 2016, Mr. Howard's legal team included Tucker Carrington from the Mississippi Innocence Project and Innocence Project lawyers Vanessa Potkin, M. Chris Fabricant, Peter Neufeld, and Dana Delger. They presented evidence that Ms. Kemp, the victim's nightgown, tested negative for semen, and no male DNA was found at all on the nightgown. Similarly, no male semen or male DNA was found on Ms. Kemp's stockings or slippers. Tests conducted on the rape kit and the bedding were negative for semen or male DNA. Tests on Ms. Kemp's fingernail scrapings were negative for male DNA. Tests on the knife revealed male DNA, but Mr. Howard was excluded, suggesting that the unidentified male DNA belonged to the person who committed the crime. Significantly, Mr. Howard's DNA was not found in any areas where he was alleged to have bitten Ms. Kemp. Robert Dubois. State, Florida. Date of exoneration, August 27, 2020. Robert Dubois was exonerated in 2020, nearly 37 years after his arrest for a 1983 murder in Florida. In 2020, through continued investigation and digging from the lead of the CRU and Dubois's counsel, slides of DNA from the original autopsy were discovered in storage at the office of the Hillsborough County Medical Examiner.
And grand theft.
But that was the only trouble you'd been in.
Yeah, but I didn't steal nothing. I didn't break nothing. I did not break in. Even the owner says I didn't break in.
The court noted earlier that all original evidence was thought to have been destroyed. Soon after this discovery, DNA testing on the remaining evidence revealed male DNA from the perpetrator and excluded Robert Dubois as a contributor. Within weeks, through the cooperation of the 13th Judicial Circuit State Attorney's Office, the Innocence Project, and the local assistance of the Innocence Project of Florida, Dubois was released from prison at August 27, 2020, into the arms of his mother, Myra, his sister, Harriet, and his attorney, Susan Friedman. A few weeks later, on September 14, 2020, the court vacated his wrongful convictions, and the state dropped the charges against him in a virtual hearing, exonerating him after 37 years of incarceration for a crime he did not commit. Kareem Johnson, State, Philadelphia. Date of exoneration, July 1, 2020. Kareem Johnson was convicted in 2006 of murder, aggravated assault, and firearms charges, and was sentenced to death in 2007. However, he was exonerated 13 years later, in 2020, due to official misconduct, false forensic evidence, and ineffective representation. His hat allegedly contained the victim's blood. However, after analysis, it was discovered that the victim's blood was on another hat, not Kareem's. Walter Ogrod. State, Pennsylvania. Date of exoneration, July 5, 2020. Ogrod, who was exonerated in 2020 after 23 years on death row, was initially convicted in 1996 based on a coerced confession and false testimony from jailhouse informants in a case further tainted by police and prosecutorial misconduct and inadequate legal representation at trial. In 2020, new DNA testing excluded Ogrod as a match to evidence found at the crime scene. This included evidence from a plastic bag covering the victim's body.
I like to buy a building, fix it up, and have a place for them to stay, because most of the people, after 20, 30, 40 years, have no family left. They got no place to go.
Paul Louis Browning. State, Las Vegas. Date of exoneration, January 2020. Browning's suit cites a long list of wrongdoing and outright fraud that caused his wrongful incarceration. Police suppressed the exculpatory witness identification of the most credible witness, the victim himself, before he died. Instead, they used the testimony of police informants staying in the same hotel as Browning, suspected of lying in other cases and being the real perpetrators themselves, to point the finger at Browning. In 2004, the Nevada Supreme Court reversed the denial of Browning's challenge to his death sentence, but he was resentenced to death on remand. While he was being sentenced again to death, his attorneys appealed to federal court. In the end, even after DNA testing exculpated him and lengthy proceedings in state court unearthed some of the previously unknown suppression of evidence and other misconduct that caused his conviction, it took 9 years more before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals acknowledged that Browning's due process rights had been violated. Ultimately, Browning was not released from prison until August 2019. However, his injustice saga was not over until the charges against him were finally dismissed with prejudice in January 20. Clemente Aguirre Jarquin. State, Florida. Date of exoneration, November 5, 2018. Aguirre was convicted and sentenced to death in 2006 for the murder of 2 neighbors, an elderly woman and her adult daughter. He steadfastly maintained his innocence, saying he had discovered the women only after they had been killed. He did not report the murders to authorities because he was an undocumented immigrant and feared deportation. With newly discovered confessions and DNA evidence pointing to the prosecution's chief witness as the actual killer, prosecutors dropped all charges against Clemente Javier Aguirre in a Seminole County, Florida courtroom on November 5, 2018. Ricky Dale Newman, State, Arkansas. Date of exoneration, October 11, 2017. An Arkansas trial judge dismissed all charges against former death row prisoner Ricky Dale Newman, setting him free on October 11th after having spent nearly 17 years in custody following the February 2001 murder of a transient woman in a hobo park on the outskirts of Van Buren, Arkansas. DNA evidence on the blanket on which the victim was found excluded Newman, and the federal defenders obtained DNA testing of the hair evidence that disproved the prosecution's trial testimony. They also discovered that prosecutors had withheld evidence from the murder scene that contradicted what Newman had described in his confession. Leon Brown and McCollum. State, North Carolina. Date of exoneration, September 2, 2014. McCollum and Brown were 19 and 15 respectively when they were arrested in 1983 on charges of raping and murdering 11-year-old Sabrina Bui. They were coerced into confessing, and police fabricated evidence against them while suppressing or ignoring evidence of their innocence. In 2014, they were exonerated after DNA evidence implicated Roscoe Artis, who had been convicted of a similar crime. North Carolina federal jury awarded $7,500,000 for the police misconduct that sent them to death row. On May 14, 2021, they were each awarded $31 million. $1 million for each year they spent in prison, plus an additional $13 million in punitive damages. Damon Thibodeau. State, Louisiana. Date of exoneration, September 28, 2012. On September 28, Damon Thibodeau was freed from death row in Louisiana after an extensive investigation, including DNA testing and the cooperation of Jefferson Parish District Attorney Paul Connick. Thibodeau was sentenced to death for the 1996 sexual assaults and murder of his cousin. He at first confessed to the attack after a 9-hour interrogation by detectives. He recanted a few hours later and claimed his confession was coerced. Robert and Michael Scott. State, Texas. Date of exoneration, October 28, 2009. While awaiting retrial in the 1991 murders of 4 teenage girls at an Austin yogurt shop, Robert and Michael Scott were released from jail. At the same time, prosecutors searched for a match to new DNA evidence that didn't come from either of them. Their convictions at their first trials were overturned on appeal. However, new DNA tests on evidence taken from the victims revealed the presence of an unknown male that proves Scott's and Springsteen's innocence. Paul House. State, Tennessee. Date of exoneration, May 12, 2009. For 22 years, House has been accused of raping and killing a neighbor in the clannish, dirt-poor hills of eastern Tennessee's Union County. He was sentenced to death in 1986. Since then, his appeals have bumped up and down a long legal staircase, ultimately reaching the U.S. Supreme Court, which questioned his guilt in a landmark 2006 ruling and ordered a new trial. After what seemed like months or years of testing of the DNA evidence preserved from the sexual assault and murder of Carolyn Muncie, District Attorney Paul Phillips finally requested for the murder charges held against Paul House to be dropped, and Special Judge John Kerry Blackwood accepted it. Michael Blair. State, Texas. Date of execution, May 27, 2008. The Collin County Court in Texas has dismissed capital murder charges against Michael Blair, who had been on death row for the 1993 murder of Ashley Estelle. After more than a decade of legal appeals and requests for DNA testing, the hair evidence that had been used to convict Blair was found to be a mistake. Kennedy Brewer. State, Mississippi. Date of exoneration, February 15, 2008. Kennedy Brewer, who spent almost 15 years on Mississippi's death row for the 1992 murder and rape of his girlfriend's 3-year-old daughter, has been exonerated of the charges, and another man, Justin Johnson, has been arrested for the same crime. A 2001 investigation by the Innocence Project found that the semen on the victim's body did not match Brewer's DNA, but did match Johnson's. Johnson was a suspect early in the case, and his blood was collected and preserved in the Mississippi State Crime Laboratory for more than 10 years. Curtis McCarty, State, Oklahoma. Date of exoneration, May 11, 2007. In 1986, Curtis Edward McCarty was convicted for the murder of a young woman in Oklahoma City. In 2007, after serving 21 years in jail and 19 years on death row, McCarty was exonerated after evidence of falsified DNA lab reports surfaced. Harold Christopher Wilson. State, Pennsylvania. Date of exoneration, November 15, 2005. More than 16 years after a Pennsylvania jury returned 3 death sentences against Harold Wilson, new DNA evidence has led to his acquittal. During Wilson's 1989 capital trial, the prosecution used racially discriminatory practices in selecting the jury. In 1999, Wilson's death sentence was overturned when a court determined that his defense counsel had failed to investigate and present mitigating evidence during his original trial. A later appeal led to the overturning of his conviction and a new trial because of the race bias in selecting the jury. The court held that at the new trial, the death penalty could not be sought. On November 15, 2005, a new jury that did not have to be death qualified and that was properly chosen acquitted Wilson of all charges. DNA evidence revealed that blood from the crime scene did not come from Wilson or any of the victims, suggesting the involvement of another assailant. Ryan Matthews, State, Louisiana. Date of exoneration, April 2004. Shortly after his 7th birthday, Matthews was arrested for the murder of a local convenience store owner by a masked young man. Witnesses described the murderer as short, no taller than 5'8". 3 witnesses interviewed by police were unable to definitively identify Matthews, who is at least 6 feet tall, as the perpetrator. But Matthews' court-appointed lawyer was ill-prepared and unable to handle inconsistencies in the state's case. Statements by a cooperating co-defendant that implicated Matthews but were contradicted by the physical evidence and the DNA evidence in the case. "He did nothing for me and did not investigate my case," Matthews says. In March 2003, Matthews' defense team won a motion to have the physical evidence retested, obtaining 7 DNA profiles from the mask, shirt, and glove worn by the gunman. The results excluded Matthews and pointed directly to another man who was serving time for a murder committed a few months after the convenience store killing and only blocks away. In April 2004, based on the DNA results and evidence that the prosecution had suppressed at trial, the court overturned Matthews' conviction and granted him bail. He was officially exonerated on August 9, 2004, when prosecutors conceded that charges should never have been brought against him. They also declared that his exoneration was in the interest of justice. Nicholas Yaris, State, Pennsylvania. Date of exoneration, July 2, 2003. Nicholas James Yaris is an American writer and storyteller who spent 22 years on death row in Pennsylvania after being wrongfully convicted of rape and murder. In 2003, a team of court-appointed lawyers, including Christina Swarns, who later became the executive director of the National Innocence Project, helped conduct a 3rd round of DNA testing, which proved that 2 unidentified men, not Yaris, had committed the crime. Ray M. Crone, State, Pennsylvania. State of exoneration, April 8, 2002. Ray Crone is an American who was wrongfully convicted of murder. He was the 100th inmate exonerated from death row since the death penalty in the United States was reinstated in 1976. On April 8, 2002, Crone was released from prison after DNA evidence proved that he did not murder the victim and identified the killer, Kenneth Phillips, a repeatedly violent sexual offender. Journalist Robert Nelson later wrote that ample crime scene evidence and interviews should have excluded Crone as a suspect, and all pointed toward Phillips. Still, this data was ignored by the police and the prosecution's purported experts. In 2005, Crone received a settlement of $1.4 million from Maricopa County and $3 million from the city of Phoenix. Charles Fain, State, Idaho. Date of exoneration, July 6, 2001. In 1984, Charles Fain was convicted for the rape and murder of a 9-year-old Nampa girl with DNA from a hair tying him to the crime. He was sentenced to death, and he sat on death row for nearly 20 years before that same DNA sample proved Fain was wrongfully convicted. The DNA testing shows that pubic hairs recovered from the undergarment and socks of the victim are not the hairs of defendant Charles Fain, then Deputy Attorney General Lawrence Wasden said in 2001. On July 6, 2001, for the first time in Idaho's history, DNA evidence voided a death sentence, and a judge signed an order clearing Fain's conviction. Frank Lee Smith, State, Florida. Date of exoneration, December 15, 2000. On December 15, 2011, months after his death and 14 years after his 1986 conviction, Frank Lee Smith was exonerated based on exculpatory DNA testing results. These results not only cleared Smith of the crime, but identified the true perpetrator, Eddie Lee Mosley, a convicted rapist and murderer currently living in the Tacachale State Center for mentally retarded defendants in Gainesville, Florida. DNA testing implicating Mosley was first presented in the case of Jerry Frank Townsend, who spent 22 years in prison after confessing to 2 crimes he didn't commit. Earl Washington. State, Virginia. Date of exoneration: October 2, 2000. Earl Washington Jr. is a former Virginia death row inmate who was fully exonerated of murder charges in 2000. He had been wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death in 1984 for the 1982 sexual assaults and murder of Rebecca Lynn Williams in Culpeper, Virginia. Washington has an IQ estimated at 69, which classifies him as intellectually disabled. He was coerced into confessing to the crime when he was arrested on an unrelated charge a year later. He narrowly escaped being executed in 1985 and 1994. Ronald Jones. State, Illinois. Date of exoneration: May 17, 1999. Ronald Jones was convicted of a crime, but DNA testing eliminated Jones from the crime. It took another 2 years for prosecutors to dismiss the charges, and Jones was released on May 7, 1999. Jones brought a federal civil rights suit against the police. The city of Chicago settled the case for $2,200,000 in 2003. Ronald Williamson. State, Oklahoma. Date of exoneration: April 1999. Ronald Keith Williamson was a former minor league baseball pitcher, who was one of 2 men wrongly convicted in 1998 in Oklahoma for the rape and murder of Deborah Sue "Debbie" Carter. His former friend, Dennis Fritz, was sentenced to life imprisonment, while Williamson was sentenced to death. Both were released 11 years later when DNA evidence proved their innocence. Their story became the subject of best-selling author John Grisham's first nonfiction book, The Innocent Man: Murder and Injustice in a Small Town, and the adapted Netflix docu-series of the same name. Robert Miller. State, Oklahoma. Date of exoneration: May 19, 2017. Robert Lee Miller, Jr. was wrongfully convicted and held on death row for 3 years after DNA evidence proved he was innocent. Miller was convicted and sentenced to death in 1988 for the murders and rapes of 2 elderly women. Semen collected from the scene pointed to someone with type A blood, and hairs found at the scene were said to have Negroid characteristics. Miller was one of 173 black men interrogated about the case, and one of 23rd to give a blood sample. Miller's blood was type A. During his interrogation, Miller said he was hallucinating and was troubled by spirits and demons. The officers interrogated Miller for 12 hours, feeding him information about the crime. Miller eventually confessed to the murders, though his description of events was inconsistent with the actual facts of the case. At trial, his lawyer used this false confession, arguing to the jury, he knew detail after detail, details only the killer would know. However, other blood samples and saliva samples from the crime scene were tested, only to discover different blood markers that were inconsistent with Miller's sample. Gilchrist said these inconsistencies may have occurred because the sample from the crime scene could have been mixed with the victim's blood. A secondary review of the hairs prompted other forensic scientists to describe Gilchrist's testimony as essentially meaningless and completely unjustified. Gilchrist's forensic examination also eliminated a man named Ronald Lott as a potential suspect at the time. However, DNA testing conducted in 1995 conclusively showed that the semen at the crime scene belonged to Lott and not Miller. Dennis Williams. State, Illinois. Date of exoneration: July 1996. In July 1996, Dennis Williams was exonerated of the 1978 murders of Lawrence Lyenberg and Carol Schmall in Homewood, Illinois. 4 other people were also exonerated for the crime. DNA testing identified the real attackers, who were later convicted of the murders. Verneal Jimerson. State, Illinois. Date of exoneration: July 1996. Verniel Jimerson was exonerated of all charges surrounding his alleged involvement in what has become known as the Ford Heights 4 case. In 1985, Jimerson had been found guilty of committing a sexual assault and double murder in Ford Heights, Illinois. He served nearly 11 years on death row before his release. 5 other defendants spent a combined 75 years in prison for the murders before DNA testing proved their innocence. Several of the most prominent causes of wrongful conviction were involved, including false confessions, unvalidated forensic science, bad lawyering, and more. The group was finally freed in 1996. Rolando Cruz and Alejandro Hernandez. State, Illinois. Date of exoneration, November 3, 1995. On February 23, 1983, 10-year-old Janine Nicarico disappeared from her home in Naperville, Illinois. Suffering from the flu, Janine was at home alone when she was abducted. Her body was found 2 days later. She had been raped and beaten to death. The only clue left behind was a boot print on the home's front door. The jury found Cruz and Hernandez guilty, but could not reach a verdict on Buckley, a third suspect. Cruz and Hernandez were sentenced to death, and Buckley was held without bond for retrial. Shortly after the trial, a serial killer named Brian Dugan confessed that he alone had committed the crime. Prosecutors dismissed the charges against Buckley, but steadfastly defended the convictions of Cruz and Hernandez. On January 19, 1989, their convictions were reversed on appeal because of prejudicial errors by prosecutors and the trial court judge. In 1995, after Cruz's second conviction was reversed and lawyers were preparing for a third trial, a police lieutenant testified at a pre-trial hearing that he took a call from 2 detectives who reported Cruz had made admissions. By the time the third trial started, the lieutenant had discovered he was on vacation in Florida on the day in question and could not have taken the detective's call. The lieutenant's testimony damaged the claim that Cruz had made admissions and was a critical factor in the trial court judge's acquitting Cruz at the close of the prosecution's evidence on November 3, 1995. Cruz was released immediately and issued a full pardon based on innocence. Charges against Hernandez were dismissed, and he was freed a month after Cruz. Ronald Cotton. State, North Carolina. Date of exoneration, June 30, 1995. Ronald Cotton was exonerated in 1995 after spending over 10 years in prison for crimes he did not commit. His convictions were based largely on flawed eyewitness identification procedures used by police at the time. In January 1985, Mr. Cotton was convicted by a jury of 1 count of rape and 1 count of burglary. In a second trial, in November 1987, Mr. Cotton was convicted of both rapes and 2 counts of burglary. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 54 years. Mr. Cotton was not able to overturn his conviction in several appeals. But in the spring of 1995, his case was given a major break. The Burlington Police Department turned over all evidence, which included the assailant's semen for DNA testing, to the defense. The samples from one victim were tested and showed no match to Mr. Cotton. At the defense's request, the results were sent to the State Bureau of Investigation's DNA database, which showed a match with a convicted person who had earlier confessed to the crime to a fellow prisoner. When the DNA test results were reported in May 1995, the district attorney and the defense dismissed all charges. Kirk Bloodsworth, State, Maryland. Date of exoneration, June 28, 1993. Kirk Noble Bloodsworth is a former Maryland waterman and the first American sentenced to death to be exonerated post-conviction by DNA testing. He had been wrongfully convicted in 1985 of the 1984 rape and first-degree murder of a 9-year-old girl in Rosedale, Maryland. When an appeal based on the DNA evidence was underway, his sentence had been commuted to 2 consecutive life sentences. He was released from prison and was exonerated in 1993. Gary Dotson, State, Illinois. Date of exoneration, April 4, 1985. Gary E. Dotson is an American man who was the first person to be exonerated of a criminal conviction by DNA evidence. In May 1979, he was found guilty and sentenced to 25 to 50 years imprisonment for rape and another 25 to 50 years for aggravated kidnapping, the terms to be served concurrently. The appellate court upheld this conviction in 1981. In 1985, the accusing witness recanted her testimony, which had been the main evidence against Dotson. He was not exonerated or pardoned at that time. Still, due to popular belief that he was a victim of a false rape accusation, Dotson went through a series of paroles and reincarcerations until DNA evidence proved his innocence in 1988. Dotson was subsequently cleared of his conviction. If you like the way we create these videos and want us to bring more cases like this to light, please hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives.